China is demolishing brand new skyscrapers. Not old ones, not damaged ones. Finished skyscrapers that have never been lived in. Some over 200 meters tall, being torn apart floor by floor because no one can afford to occupy them and no one can afford to maintain them. And the company that built many of them just got delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, carrying $340 billion in debt. That's not a typo. That's roughly 2% of China's entire GDP, owed by a single company that sold 1.4 million homes that don't exist yet. This is the Chinese property crisis, the largest real estate collapse in human history. 65 million empty apartments, 20 million families paying mortgages on homes that were never finished, and a demolition campaign that analysts have described as build, pause, demolish, repeat. It's either the most spectacular financial implosion since Lehman Brothers, or a slow-motion economic correction that will take a generation to resolve. Probably both. So let's find out how a country built enough empty housing to shelter the entire population of the United Kingdom, why they're now blowing it up, and whether the worst is already over or just getting started. Here's the thing about China's property market. It wasn't just a market, it was the economy. Real estate and its associated industries accounted for roughly 30% of China's GDP, not 5%, not 10%. Nearly a third of everything the world's second largest economy produced was tied, directly or indirectly, to pouring concrete and selling flats, and the machine worked beautifully for decades. Between 1995 and 2021, China's urbanization rate rocketed from 29% to 65%. That same shift took the United States 70 years. China did it in 26. That means roughly 500 million people moved from rural villages into cities in a single generation, and every one of them needed somewhere to live. Developers scaled up accordingly. China was constructing more than 10 million residential units annually. For context, Europe and the United States combined build around 3 million. But here's the structural problem that made the whole system a ticking bomb. In China, the state owns all land. Local governments lease it to developers, keeping 100% of the revenue. By the 2000s and 10s, land sales accounted for 35 to 40% of total local government revenue. Entire municipal budgets depended on the assumption that developers would keep buying land at ever-increasing prices, and that citizens would keep buying the apartments built on it. And citizens did keep buying because property was the only game in town. Around 90% of Chinese households own property. Only about 7% invest in the stock market. With limited investment alternatives, no property tax, and prices that climbed relentlessly for 2 decades, buying apartments became the national savings strategy. Some families bought 2, 3, 4 apartments they never intended to live in. Investment vehicles made of reinforced concrete, which brings us to the truly deranged part. In most countries, you buy a home when it's built, or at least close to completion. In the UK, buyers of pre-sale homes put down a deposit to reserve a property. They don't start paying the mortgage until the keys are in their hand. Reasonable, sane. China did the opposite. In China, 87% of new homes were sold before construction was finished. Some before it had even started. Buyers would put down deposits, take out full mortgages, and begin making monthly payments on apartments that existed only as architectural renderings and a patch of excavated dirt, not partial payments. Full mortgage servicing on a building that might be a hole in the ground. Now here's the bit that should make you physically angry. Chinese regulations required pre-sale payments to be deposited into escrow accounts supervised by local authorities and banks. Funds were supposed to be released in batches, only as construction progressed. In practice, there was widespread collusion between developers and local officials. Developers routinely funneled pre-sale funds into their own accounts, used them to buy more land, start more projects, and generate more pre-sales. The local governments looked the other way because they were profiting from the land sales. So the developer would take those pre-sale payments, use them not just to build the project those buyers had paid for, but to fund entirely new developments, using fresh deposits to cover old commitments. If this sounds familiar, it's because the financial structure is essentially indistinguishable from a Ponzi scheme. It works brilliantly as long as new money keeps flowing in. The moment it stops, everything collapses, and it stopped. Between 2013 and 2020, according to estimates from Nomura, Chinese developers delivered only around 60% of the homes they pre-sold. That means 4 out of every 10 families who handed over their life savings received nothing. Not a delayed apartment, not a partial refund, nothing. Just mortgage payments on a concrete skeleton that may never have walls. Consider a man from Zhengzhou, identified in media reports only as Chen. In 2015, he invested his entire savings, combined with his parents' money, to put a down payment on an apartment. A decade later, he's still paying the mortgage. The building was never completed. He survived on potatoes for 72 days straight at one point just to keep up payments. Demolitions. He wrote a folk song about the injustice of homebuyers' predicament. The government censored the song. He protested outside local government offices. He was detained for 3 days. Without property ownership, Chen estimates his chances of marriage at nearly 0. In China, home ownership is a prerequisite for marriage for most families. Marriage is a prerequisite for social mobility. His situation isn't unique. An estimated 20 million people across China share paying mortgages on homes that don't exist, trapped in a system that took their money and delivered rubble. And if you want to see how this gets even more catastrophic, subscribe now, because what China did next managed to make everything worse. By 2020, Beijing knew it had a problem. Developers were borrowing recklessly. Evergrande alone had invested in electric vehicles, a water bottling company, and a football team, all funded by debt and pre-sale deposits meant for apartment construction. So the government introduced what became known as the 3 red lines, financial regulations that capped how much developers could borrow based on their debt-to-cash, debt-to-asset, and debt-to-equity ratios. The intention was sensible: reduce leverage, force discipline, prevent a bubble from inflating further. The execution was catastrophic. At the time, the policy launched, only 6.3% of rated real estate developers could comply with all 3 thresholds. The rest were suddenly cut off from the borrowing they needed to keep operating. Remember, the entire business model depended on continuous access to new capital. Taking that away didn't gently deflate the bubble, it detonated it. Sector credit plunged 53% in the first half of 2022. Developer sales fell 51%. And then the dominoes started falling. Evergrande missed its first offshore bond payment in September 2021. By December, it was in restricted default. But Evergrande wasn't alone. Country Garden, Kaisa Group, Fantasia Holdings, Sunac, Cynic Holdings, Modern Land. By 2024, 77 property developers had defaulted on their debts. More than 50 developers, accounting for roughly 40% of China's home sales, went under. The combined offshore bond defaults exceeded $160 billion. Peking University economist Yao Yang has publicly called the 3 red lines policy a fundamental error, arguing it triggered a self-reinforcing death spiral of eroded confidence, stalled projects, and cascading defaults. The timing couldn't have been worse either. The policy overlapped with China's strict zero-COVID lockdowns, which disrupted construction, halted pre-sales, and froze cash flows for developers already hemorrhaging money. 2 crises running simultaneously, feeding off each other. The result? Housing prices have fallen roughly 20% from their 2021 peak. New housing starts have collapsed by 75%. Property sales halved. And in cities where Evergrande and Country Garden operated, primarily the Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities where China's working class lives, the damage has been devastating. These weren't luxury penthouses in Shanghai. They were modest apartments on the edges of mid-sized cities, bought by families who pooled 3 generations of savings to make a down payment. The cure, it turned out, was more lethal than the disease. Which brings us to the demolitions, and they are, by any measure, properly unhinged. August 27th, 2021, Kunming, capital of Yunnan province. 15 high-rise buildings, each between 20 and 30 stories tall, detonated simultaneously. 4.6 metric tons of explosives, 85,000 individual detonation points, 45 seconds, gone. These buildings had been abandoned for 7 years after the developer ran out of money. Over 5,300 residents from surrounding neighborhoods were evacuated. Each household received approximately $23 in compensation. A woman watching the blast told a reporter from the live stream that it was the most exciting moment of her life. She'd never seen buildings blown up before. Another onlooker said simply, "What a pity. It cost a lot of money to build those." And Kunming wasn't isolated. In Hainan province, towers were demolished because officials discovered they'd been illegally developed. In Tianjin, 3 brand new residential towers, reaching up to 208 meters, 65 stories, were condemned for demolition because the developer had secretly added 30 floors beyond the approved plans. The building's main structures were fully complete, but because of their size and central location, they couldn't be safely brought down with explosives. They had to be dismantled manually, floor by floor, from the top down. Engineers noted there was no precedent for manually demolishing a building over 200 meters tall. The estimated cost was $10 to $12 million, borne by Tianjin's taxpayers. The developer, the son of a former provincial Communist Party Secretary General, arrested in a corruption crackdown. Analysts have warned that Beijing appears to have adopted a strategy that can be summarized in 4 words: build, pause, demolish, repeat. Demolishing excess supply prevents prices from falling further. New construction provides employment. The cycle continues, except the waste is staggering. The embedded carbon, the steel, the concrete, the human labor, all turned to dust and rubble for the sake of maintaining an economic fiction. And beyond the demolitions, there's the quieter horror, the ghost cities. Across China, more than 50 major urban developments stand in varying states of abandonment. Kangbashi New Area in Ordos, Inner Mongolia, designed for 1 million residents, occupied by a fraction. Ujiapu Financial District in Tianjin, promoted as China's Manhattan, its office towers 75% empty. In Shenyang, 260 European-style mansions costing over $220 million sit vacant. Their Italian leather furniture under sheets of dust, while local farmers grow vegetables on the luxury roads between them. Evergrande alone left roughly 800,000 pre-sold homes unfinished across 1,300 developments in 280 cities. One of its most ambitious projects, the Evergrande Cultural Tourism City in Jiangsu Province, was designed to rival Disney Shanghai. It was planned as a 263-acre development, combining residences with a theme park. Aerial photographs from 2024 show fantasy castles slowly being consumed by vegetation. A theme park for no one, built with the deposits of families who will never see their apartments. But here's where the engineering horror becomes a human one. Zoom out from the explosions and the statistics, and you find people like a woman identified in reports as Miss Xu. She lives in her unfinished apartment because she has no alternative, no gas, no electricity, no running water. She carries water up several flights of stairs daily from an outdoor hose. She shares a makeshift outdoor toilet with roughly 20 other residents who made the same desperate choice. She invested everything into this apartment for her son, so he could start a family. Now, it's a shell with holes where electrical sockets should be. In July 2022, it broke. Thousands of homebuyers across more than 100 Chinese cities organized on social media, on WeChat, Douyin, and Weibo, and collectively announced they would stop paying their mortgages. The mortgage boycott. The list started with 30 projects. Within days, it exceeded 300. ANZ estimated that $223 billion in mortgage loans could be affected. The government responded by censoring the social media accounts associated with the protests. But the damage to trust was done. And here's the number that should terrify every policymaker in Beijing. 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied to real estate. Housing prices have fallen roughly 20% from their 2021 peak. New housing starts have collapsed by 75%. Goldman Sachs estimates that China's unsold housing inventory, if fully built, would amount to 93 trillion yuan, approximately $13 trillion. To bring inventory back to even 2018 levels would require over $2 trillion in government spending. The government's current rescue package, $42 billion. That's roughly 2% of what's needed. From its peak market capitalization of $51.7 billion in 2017, Evergrande's shares were suspended at a value of approximately $275 million before being formally delisted in August 2025. Its founder, Xu Jiayi, once one of Asia's wealthiest individuals, was detained in 2023 on suspicion of criminal activity. The securities regulator later discovered the company had inflated its 2019 and 2020 revenues by approximately $80 billion. The world's most valuable real estate brand in 2018 turned out to be running fabricated numbers. So here we are, the Chinese property crisis. $340 billion in debt at a single company, 77 developers in default, 65 million empty apartments, 20 million families paying for homes that don't exist, new skyscrapers demolished before anyone moves in, entire neighborhoods detonated in 45 seconds. A former deputy head of the National Statistics Bureau publicly stating there are probably more empty homes in China than the country's 1.4 billion people could fill. The government is trying. Local authorities have been directed to buy unsold apartments and convert them to affordable housing. Banks have approved 6.7 trillion yuan in special loans to finish stalled projects. Some cities have even forcibly relocated schools and government offices into ghost districts to create demand. In Kangbashi, the original ghost city, a high school's prestige drove enough families to move in that the population reached 127,000, still a fraction of the million originally planned, but not nothing. Goldman Sachs predicts prices might stabilize around 2027, assuming Beijing delivers an additional $1.1 trillion in fiscal support that hasn't been announced yet. Without it, prices could fall another 20 to 25%, reaching roughly half their peak value. The IMF expects fundamental demand for new housing to drop 35 to 55% over the next decade due to declining population and the enormous backlog of unsold inventory. China built the greatest construction machine in human history. It urbanized 500 million people in a generation, raised the homeownership rate to 96%, and made real estate the backbone of the world's second-largest economy. Then it discovered that you can build cities for no one, sell homes that don't exist, demolish towers that were never occupied, and call the whole thing growth. It was the most spectacular misallocation of capital the world has ever seen. Not because the buildings were poorly engineered, most of them were structurally fine. The engineering failure wasn't in the concrete. It was in the financial architecture underneath it, a system that treated apartments as both shelter and savings accounts, that let developers operate as leveraged hedge funds, that allowed local governments to fund basic services through a speculative land casino. The buildings are coming down. The question is whether confidence can ever be rebuilt, because concrete, however many millions of tons of it you pour, is easier to manufacture than trust. And trust, once demolished, doesn't come back in 45 seconds. Would you buy a home in China right now?